Picture this. It's the dead of night in a fortress high above the Rajasthani desert. The air is heavy with the smell of smoke and the metallic tang of fear. Outside the walls, war drums pound in the distance, a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat that does not belong to you. Inside, the courtyards are lit by hundreds of oil lamps, their flames flickering in the wind. Women move through the shadows, not running, not crying, but walking in silence. They are dressed in bridal red, shimmering silk saris, gold ornaments, jasmine flowers in their hair. The sound of anklets rings faintly against the cold stone floors. Their faces are calm, but their eyes carry the weight of something unthinkable. At the center of the courtyard, a pyre blazes, its flames stretching toward the black sky. This is not a funeral. It is an act of choice, or perhaps of no choice at all. The women are here to perform Jauhar, the ritual mass self-immolation undertaken when all hope is gone, when the fortress will fall and the enemy will show no mercy. Far away in the shadows of the ramparts, the men of the fort prepare for Saka, the last doomed ride into battle. They know they will not return. They know that when they fall, their wives, sisters, and daughters will already be gone. Their bodies turn to ash before enemy hands can touch them. The drums outside grow louder. Inside, the flames roar. One by one, the women step forward, and as the first body falls into the fire, the fortress begins to sing. Not in words, but in the sound of crackling flames, devouring silk and gold and flesh. This is not legend. This is history. And it happened more than once. To understand Jauhar, you have to first understand the siege. A siege was not just a battle, it was a slow death. Imagine a desert fortress in medieval Rajasthan, its sandstone walls glowing in the sun, watchtowers scanning the horizon. Inside, life is deceptively calm. Markets open at dawn, temple bells ring, children play in the courtyards. But far in the distance, a dust cloud begins to rise. It is not a storm. It is an army. And it is coming for you. When invaders arrived, they did not always charge the gates. They surrounded the fort like a tightening noose. No one in, no one out. Supply lines were cut. The wells might be poisoned, the fields outside burned. Slowly, food began to vanish from the storerooms. Oil lamps burned lower. Even water became precious. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The once bustling fort became quieter. The clanging of temple bells was replaced by the creak of empty grain sacks. Hunger gnawed at the soldiers on the ramparts, and fear settled into the hearts of those below. And always, outside, the enemy waited. Sometimes their drums would sound at night, not to attack, but to remind the defenders, "We are still here. We will outlast you." The women of the fort knew what that meant. They knew what happened when the gates finally fell. Because in those times, the fall of a fort meant more than defeat. For the men, it meant death on the battlefield. But for women, it meant being captured alive, taken as war prizes. Queens, princesses, and noblewomen were paraded as trophies. Others were enslaved, sent to far-off lands, sold in foreign markets, or placed in the harems of the conquerors. The reality was not romantic. It was brutal. It was a fate often considered worse than death itself. And so, in the Rajput code of honor, there was only one way to avoid it: Jauhar. But Jauhar was never the first choice. It was the last resort. A decision made only when all hope was gone. Before such a decision was taken, the fort's council would meet. The rulers, generals, priests, and senior queens. In a dimly lit chamber, voices would rise in urgent debate. Could they hold out longer? Could help come from an ally? Could they attempt a breakout? The queen's voice mattered here, perhaps more than the king's. Because while the men could still ride out to fight, it was the women who would face the consequences of failure. When the council decided the fort could not be saved, the order was given. And from that moment, the fortress changed. The air seemed heavier. The chatter in the streets died away. The people moved differently, slower, quieter, as if carrying the weight of what was to come. Preparations began. Firewood was gathered in secret. Oil was brought from storerooms. In some accounts, the pyre was built in an underground chamber to hide the act from enemy eyes until it was done. In others, it was raised in the open courtyard, a final act of defiance, daring the enemy to watch. The women began their own preparations, but this was no hurried act of desperation. It was treated like a wedding. They bathed dressed in bridal red, adorned themselves with gold and silver, and painted their hands with henna. In Rajput tradition, a bride's attire was not just for marriage. It was also worn for her final journey, whether that was to her husband's home or to the flames. Why such ritual in the face of such horror? Perhaps it was to give dignity to the undignified. Perhaps it was to keep courage alive in the younger women and children, to transform fear into something they could face without screaming. As the pyre was prepared, the men of the fort also made ready. This was the moment of Saka, the ritual last battle. Once the women were gone, the gates would be thrown open, and every man able to fight would charge out to meet the enemy. They wore saffron robes, the color of sacrifice, and smeared ash upon their foreheads. They did not expect to return. They only hoped to take as many enemies as possible with them. The knowledge of what awaited them gave the men a grim strength. They would fight knowing their families had chosen death over dishonor, and that they had been spared the cruelty of the conqueror's hands. In the Rajput ethos, both Jauhar and Saka were acts of ultimate loyalty, to family, to kingdom, to dharma. But to the outsider, it could only seem like a terrible double tragedy. Hundreds dead in the flames, hundreds more on the battlefield, all in a single day. And yet, in the minds of those within those walls, it was not tragedy. It was control. A way to choose the manner of their own ending, in a world where the enemy sought to take everything from them: body, name, honor, and even memory. The decision once made, there was no turning back. The fires would be lit, the gates would open, and the fate of the fort would be sealed. This is how the stage was set for Jauhar, not as an act of madness, but as the final, inevitable step in the long, suffocating desperation of a siege. Jauhar was not chaos, it was order, terrifying, deliberate order. By the time the decision was made, the fortress had already changed. Every movement within its walls carried a strange stillness, as if the very stones understood what was about to happen. The sky might be blue, the sun warm, but inside the hearts of the people there was a cold finality. The first signs began quietly. The palace attendants moved through storerooms, retrieving oil, ghee, and bundles of dry wood. Soldiers and servants carried the firewood not to kitchens, but to a courtyard or hidden chamber chosen for the ritual. In some forts, it was done underground, so the flames could be shielded from enemy sight. In others, it was done in the open, a defiant blaze visible even to the besiegers outside. Once the place was chosen, the pyre was built layer by layer. Thick logs formed the base, then thinner branches, then dry grass to catch the first spark. Vessels of clarified butter and oil were kept nearby to feed the fire quickly. Meanwhile, the women prepared themselves. In Rajput tradition, a woman meeting death through Jauhar dressed as a bride. Not in mourning white, but in the deepest red, the color of marriage, of blood, of final vows. Necklaces of gold, bangles of silver, anklets of bells were brought out of chests. Jasmine flowers were woven into their hair. Henna was painted onto palms, curling into delicate patterns that would burn with them. For the younger women and children, who perhaps did not understand the full meaning, these preparations were softened, made to feel like part of a festival. Songs might be sung, not to celebrate, but to keep fear from breaking the fragile dignity of the moment. The queens led the way. Often the senior queen, the Maharani, was the first to approach the pyre. She would walk slowly, head held high, eyes fixed forward. She would not look back. In her steps was the unspoken message to the others: we go together. We go without fear. Priests chanted mantras beside the pyre. These were not funeral rites. They were vows, invocations to the gods, prayers for the soul's liberation. the air filled with the low hum of Sanskrit, with the scent of burning incense mingling with the smell of the wood. As the women gathered, the men who would ride out for Saka stood apart, watching in silence. There was no embrace, no farewell. To touch in that moment was to risk breaking the will. And so they stood, saffron robes catching the wind, faces like stone. When the moment came, the fire was lit. Flames licked the edges of the wood, growing, snapping, spitting sparks into the air. The heat thickened, making the air shimmer. One by one, the women stepped forward. Some held children in their arms. Some walked in pairs, hands clasped. There were no screams, at least none recorded. If voices rose, they rose in the chanting of God's names. Har Har Mahadev, Govind, Shyam. The fire consumed quickly. Silk flared, gold melted, flowers blackened to ash. The smoke rose straight into the night sky, carrying with it the last breath of those within. As the final figures disappeared into the blaze, the gates of the fortress were unbarred. The men mounted their horses, armed not for victory but for vengeance. They rode out in a wave of steel and saffron, charging into the enemy ranks. A final act called Saka, where every man fought until cut down, knowing there was no home left to return to. From the enemy camp, the scene was strange. The smoke rising from the fort was not from cooking fires, but from a single roaring pyre. The Rajputs riding out seemed possessed by a fury beyond fear. And when the battle ended, all that remained within the fort was silence and ash. Jauhar was not an accident of history. It was a ritual, one that existed in the minds of its people long before it was enacted. Every step, from the gathering of wood to the bridal dress to the unbarred gates, was part of a shared understanding of honor and inevitability. And yet within that order lay unimaginable tragedy. The loss was not only of life, but of future, of the children who would never grow, the voices that would never sing again, the stories that would never be told. For the survivors outside, it was a sight that burned itself into memory. For the victors, it was a reminder that even in defeat, the Rajputs could deny them the spoils of war. For history, it became a haunting question. Was this ultimate courage or ultimate despair? To understand the terror of Jauhar, you must understand the enemy. Not just as soldiers with swords, but as a force that turned life inside a fortress into a waiting room for death. Or something worse. Because the real fear was not battle. The real fear began after the battle ended, when the gates fell, when the last arrow flew, when silence replaced the clash of steel. That silence was never mercy. For medieval India, especially in the north and west, the invaders came wave after wave. From the Ghaznavids in the 11th century to the Ghurids, the Khaljis, the Tughlaqs, the Lodis, the Mughals, and later Afghan raiders, many of these armies were not just conquerors but occupiers, not just fighters but enslavers. And they knew that to win a war was not enough. To break a kingdom, you had to break its pride, its queens, its daughters, its very sense of sanctity. So when a fort fell, the horrors began. The women were the first victims. Royal consorts were dragged out of palace chambers, stripped of jewelry, stripped of identity. Some were forced into harems. Others were sold in markets, even beyond India, to Central Asia, Persia, the Middle East. These were not dramatizations. They were transactions, recorded in court memoirs and travel accounts. Many were forced to convert. Many were never seen again. The nobility was humiliated. Sacred temples were desecrated. Idols were smashed. Libraries burned. Histories erased. Not just as acts of victory, but as warnings. And if you think this is poetic exaggeration, listen to the chroniclers themselves. Ziauddin Barani, the 14th century historian of the Delhi Sultanate, proudly recorded that the defeat of Hindu kings meant their wives and daughters became gifts to Muslim nobles. Amir Khusrau, though a brilliant poet, also described the spoils of war in ways that left no ambiguity. Women were counted among them. It was state policy, not just battlefield chaos. And this is why Jauhar existed. It was not rooted in a love for death. It was born from a deep, paralyzing fear of what came after defeat. Because unlike the battlefield, where one dies quickly, the fate of captured women stretched on for years, as concubines, slaves, or forgotten names in distant lands. For a Rajput queen whose life revolved around dharma, dignity, and honor, there was no place in that future. But it wasn't only the elite who feared this fate. Even common women, wives of soldiers, daughters of merchants, knew the pattern. Conquest was not just political, it was deeply personal. It invaded the home, the womb, the memory. Imagine watching your city fall, knowing that the fire consuming your temple will soon consume your name. Now imagine knowing there is no help coming, that no ally will rescue you, that the walls will not hold. That is when Jauhar became a decision, not from power, but from the total loss of it. There are recorded instances where women begged their rulers to permit Jauhar not to protest, but to demand the right to choose death over humiliation. And for those who survived, those who witnessed the aftermath of a fort that fell without Jauhar, the scars lasted lifetimes. We have letters, folk songs, fragments of poetry that speak of mothers searching for their daughters, only to hear they were taken to Kabul or Baghdad, of wives who were never found, of temples turned into mosques, names changed, genealogies erased. The brutality of invading armies was not a myth spread by nationalist historians. It was recorded by the invaders themselves, often with pride. It was systemic, it was strategic, and it was feared more than fire. Jauhar, in that sense, was both a protest and a surrender. It was a refusal to be made into property. It was a final violent act of self-ownership. But that doesn't make it less tragic. Because even as it gave back a sliver of control to those who had none, it still meant hundreds, sometimes thousands, of lives lost. Women who might have lived, girls who barely understood what was happening. Entire generations turned to ash in a single night. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. That the ritual, for all its fire and finality, never felt like a victory. There were no songs sung after Jauhar, only echoes. There were no monuments built, only ashes scattered beneath the sand. And while the invaders might have written their victories in stone, the women wrote their resistance in flame, nameless, faceless, voiceless. That was the price of surviving with honor, even if it meant not surviving at all. There are flames that die when the fire ends, and then there are flames that live in memory, burning centuries later not in wood, but in the stories we tell. The most famous of these flames began in Chittorgarh. It was the year 1303. The Delhi Sultanate was ruled by Alauddin Khilji, a man of ambition and appetite. His eyes had turned toward the kingdom of Mewar, and within it, the fort of Chittor, a fortress carved into stone, guarded by Rajput swords, and protected by a queen whose name would echo across history. Her name was Rani Padmini. Legend says she was not just beautiful, but wise, fierce, and deeply respected. Khilji heard of her beauty and demanded to see her, not in person but reflected in a mirror. What followed was a political insult, a game of pride and ego, a demand that no Rajput queen would tolerate. War was inevitable. Khilji laid siege to Chittor. The fort held out for months, but it was only a matter of time. The enemy's forces were overwhelming. The walls would fall. The choice had to be made. And so Rani Padmini and the women of Chittorgarh, nearly 800 of them, lit the fire. Dressed as brides singing war songs, they walked into the flames. The heat must have been unbearable. The scent of ghee and jasmine, of silk and smoke, must have lingered in the air long after the last figure vanished. When the gates were finally broken, Khilji entered the fort. But there was no queen to capture. Only ash, only silence, only a kingdom that had chosen dignity over submission. This was the first Jauhar of Chittorgarh, but it was not the last. The second Jauhar came nearly 2 centuries later in 1535, when Bahadur Shah of Gujarat attacked Chittorgarh again. This time the fort was defended by Rani Kanavati, a warrior queen in her own right. She too faced impossible odds, and once again the fire was lit. This time, 13,000 women are said to have walked into the blaze. Can you imagine that? 13,000 voices, 13,000 final breaths. The third Jauhar took place in 1568 during the siege by Emperor Akbar, the most powerful of all Mughal rulers. Though he was later known for tolerance and diplomacy, this early conquest was bloody and uncompromising. Once again, the women of Chittor chose fire over chains. 3 times the same fortress, 3 times the same flames. But Chittorgarh was not alone. The fortress of Ranthambore too saw its own Jauhar in 1301. As Khilji's army closed in, the queen and her companions performed the ritual, while the men rode out in saffron robes to face death. Ranthambore would later become a hunting ground for the Mughals, but long before that, it was a tomb of fire and memory. In Jaisalmer, the desert winds still whisper stories of its own great Jauhar, led by Queen Rani Bhattiyani. Some versions say it happened twice, once against the Khiljis and again against Timur's forces. Local ballads still sing of the queens and princesses who vanished into the firelight while the city walls crumbled behind them. There is even a lesser-known tale from Gwalior, where during a Mughal siege, a small contingent of noble women carried out a private Jauhar, hidden from history but not from memory. In each of these stories, we see the same pattern: siege, hopelessness, ritual, fire. But what varies is the scale. Some were performed by a few dozen women in stone courtyards, others involved entire towns, thousands of voices, mothers and daughters, walking silently into the blaze. Sometimes it was witnessed, other times it was recorded only in poetry, in fading manuscripts, or oral folk songs passed down like sacred scripture. And still, centuries later, their names are whispered with reverence. Padmini, Kanavati, Bhattiyani, not just as queens, but as symbols. Symbols of resistance, of sacrifice, of a kind of power that only appears when everything else has been stripped away. But let us not romanticize this too quickly. These were not fairy tales. They were not grand, glorious moments of pride. They were decisions made under pressure, in terror, under siege. Some of the women were young girls, some were pregnant, some must have begged to live. Some perhaps were forced. And yet, the fires were lit, the rituals were followed, and the silence that followed was absolute. What we are left with is not just history but ambiguity. Were these acts of heroism or of horror, of autonomy or of desperation? The fort walls still stand. The battlefields are quiet now. The ash has long since blown away. But the stories burn on. Jauhar is a story carved in fire. But behind the flames, behind the poetry and the praise, lies a harder question. Was it honor or was it oppression? For centuries, Indian folklore has painted Jauhar in vivid colors. In Rajput ballads, it is sung as a sacred rite, a final act of loyalty, a queen's refusal to let her body be claimed, even in defeat. In Rajasthani oral tradition, queens like Padmini and Kanavati are remembered not just as women, but as Devis, goddesses of courage. But history, unlike legend, has room for contradictions. And when the dust of pride settles, what we're left with is a deeper silence, one filled with uncomfortable truths. Let us begin with the idea of honor. In Rajput society, honor, or izzat, was everything. A man's honor lived in his sword. A woman's honor lived in her body. To lose either was to lose selfhood. So when enemies threatened to violate that sacred line, death was seen as the only acceptable alternative. In that light, Jauhar was not suicide. It was seen as sacrifice, the ultimate offering at the altar of collective identity. But what if the very concept of honor was flawed? What if a woman's worth should not have been tied to her physical sanctity? What if survival, even after defeat, was a greater form of strength? These are modern questions, but they force us to relook at what was once accepted without hesitation. Because woven into the story of Jauhar is the thread of patriarchy. The decision to perform Jauhar often came from royal councils, dominated by men. The pressure to die with dignity was not always a personal choice, but a societal expectation. A queen refusing to participate might have been seen not as brave, but as dishonorable. Imagine that, choosing to live branded as shameful, while walking into fire made you a saint. That's not choice, that's conditioning. In many instances, we have no records of what the women felt. No letters, no journals, no songs written by them, only accounts about them, written by priests, poets, or foreign chroniclers. Their silence was preserved, both in history and in the act of Jauhar itself. And that silence raises haunting possibilities. Were all the women truly willing? Did the youngest girls understand what was happening? Were they given a voice or merely told to accept their fate as tradition required? In modern terms, this would be unthinkable, but in those times it was law, not legal law, but cultural law, a code written into the bones of the land, passed down through customs, enforced through stories. This is where the tension lies. Because Jauhar, despite its tragedy, was also a form of resistance, a way to deny the invader his victory. To say, you may conquer the fort, but you will never conquer me. In that defiance, there is something powerful, something admirable. But in the burning of thousands of lives, lives that might have flourished, rebelled, escaped, or rebuilt, there is also unbearable loss. It's not just a story of what happened, it's a story of what could have been. There are other ways to measure bravery: in survival, in endurance, in rebuilding from ashes rather than becoming them. Some historians point out that not all Rajput kingdoms performed Jauhar. Others negotiated, retreated, regrouped. In some cases, queens were captured and lived. Some resisted from within enemy courts, influencing politics quietly. Others raised children who later reclaimed their ancestral lands. So was Jauhar always necessary? Or was it a ritual born from an imagination that could not envision a woman surviving defeat with dignity? That's the hardest part to confront, that what we call heroism may also have been a cage. A gilded one, yes, lined with poetry and pride, but a cage all the same. And yet we must be careful. It is easy from the comfort of centuries later to judge, to project modern morality onto a world built on survival, swordplay, and sacred codes. We were not there. We did not feel the fear. We did not hear the war drums in the night, or see the gates splintering, or watch our daughters cling to us in terror. In those final hours, the line between choice and no choice disappears. What remains is the fire and the silence. Today, Jauhar lives on in folklore, in films, in statues and temples, but also in debates, in classrooms, in feminist circles, in the discomfort of every Indian who tries to explain it to the world. Because it is not just history, it is identity. And that identity is complicated. It tells us that women can be brave, but only in death, that their strength lies in sacrifice, but never in rebellion, that their purity is sacred, but their desires are silent. To tell the story of Jauhar is to walk a tightrope between honoring the courage and questioning the culture, between reverence and reckoning. And perhaps that's the only way to truly remember it, not as a tale of fire alone, but as a mirror of the society that lit it. When the fires died, nothing remained but ash. No grave, no names, no last words etched in stone. Only the blackened earth where silk had turned to smoke and queens had turned to legend. And yet, somehow Jauhar did not end in the flames. It continued in a quieter way, in memory, in whispers, in stories passed from grandmother to granddaughter, beneath the desert stars, long after the drums of war had faded. She walked into the fire, but she did not scream. She held her daughter close and told her, "Die proud." The queen was the first to walk, and none looked away. These were not just tales. They were inheritances, wounds carried through generations, dressed up as heroism so that they wouldn't hurt so much. Today, the ruins of those forts still stand. In Chittorgarh, tourists climb ancient steps, worn smooth by centuries of feet. They walk past temples and gates, across battlements, through echoing halls that once rang with commands and prayers. And then quietly they come to the place where the pyre once burned. There is no flame now, only a plaque and silence. Many don't speak here. Some take off their shoes, some leave flowers. Others stare, uncertain how to feel. Reverent, proud, grief-stricken? What is the proper emotion to offer a place where hundreds of women chose death? The government calls these sites heritage monuments. Historians file them under medieval military architecture. Tour guides speak in neutral tones. But something lingers in the air, a heaviness that doesn't lift. Because Jauhar was never just about history. It was about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. Modern India often doesn't know what to do with Jauhar. Some celebrate it as an act of unmatched bravery. Others condemn it as a dark symbol of patriarchy. Most fall somewhere in between, proud of the courage, haunted by the cost. In textbooks, it gets a paragraph. In films, it gets a slow-motion scene, heavy with music and fire. In political speeches, it gets twisted, used to stoke pride or provoke anger. But in the hearts of many, it still burns. Especially for Rajasthani women, for Rajput descendants, for those whose ancestors may have walked into those flames, or fought outside the gates as their families vanished behind them. Some wear the memory like armor, others carry it like a scar. You see it in weddings and rituals, in the way brides are dressed. Red silk, gold bangles, the echo of a tradition that once led not to a marriage bed, but to a funeral pyre. You hear it in folk songs, where the women are always brave, always silent, always perfect in their sacrifice. You feel it in the tension, the discomfort that comes when someone asks, couldn't they have escaped? Was it really their choice? Would we still expect the same today? Because that's the question no one wants to answer. Would we still call a woman honorable only if she burns? Have we really moved on? India has changed. We have laws now. Rights, voices louder than ever. Queens have been replaced by leaders, forts by cities, swords by headlines. And yet we still struggle with the same dilemmas. What is a woman's worth? What do we demand of her in crisis? And who decides how she should respond? Jauhar lives on, not in action but in expectation. We still tell girls to be pure, to protect the family's name, to sacrifice, to stay silent when wronged, to burn quietly even if not in fire. So perhaps the embers of Jauhar are not only in Rajasthan, perhaps they're in boardrooms, in newsrooms, in family courts, in whispered judgments, in poems where women die beautiful but never live complicated. That is the danger of glorifying pain. It makes us forget that those who walked into the fire were people, not symbols, that they might have wanted to live, that they had dreams, fears, doubts, that maybe, just maybe, some of them stepped into the blaze because there was no one left to fight for another way. And maybe the real tragedy is not that they died, but that we still haven't learned to ask why they felt they had to. So as we look back at Jauhar, let us do so with both reverence and resistance. Let us remember the queens, not just for how they died, but for the power they were denied, for the silence that followed them, for the strength it takes to question the very myths we inherited. Let us teach their stories, but let us also teach our daughters that bravery can be loud and messy and alive. Let us preserve the ruins, but not as altars of obedience. Let them stand instead as questions carved in stone. What is honor? What is freedom? And how many more must burn before we find a better answer?